Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lisa Clark. I'm the head of DEI at Cell Press. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this inclusive language and scientific publishing webinar on age and aging. My colleagues from The Lancet and I are excited to host this discussion with our panelists and answer your questions from the audience. As some of you may know, 2024 marks our 50th anniversary. At Cell Press, we believe that to meet our greatest challenges, the world needs science that inspires. During our anniversary year, we're reflecting on the past, looking to the future, and most importantly, celebrating with all of you. So thank you so much for being here. Throughout 2024 and beyond, we are focusing on the real-world impact of the science we publish. We've been hosting some exciting virtual events like this one, commissioning special anniversary content in our journals, and working to launch initiatives that we hope will inspire new directions in research over the next 50 years, all with the goal of making the world a better place. Today, our panel will focus on the theme of age and aging, shedding light on how we describe these concepts in research. We will delve into ways to avoid stigmatizing language and prevent the perpetuation of stereotypes. This is a unique opportunity to gain valuable insights and contribute to a more inclusive scientific community. We are honored to have two distinguished speakers for this panel, Professor Paula Rochon from the University of Toronto and Professor Desmond O'Neill from Trinity College Dublin. You'll hear more about them momentarily and be able to ask them questions in the Q&A following their presentations. I'm now going to hand things over to my colleague, Rachel Tucker, to introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Alyssa, for that lovely introduction. My name is Rachel Tucker. I'm a scientific editor at Helion at Cell Press. A huge thank you for our audience members, our panelists, and to my fellow hosts for joining us today. And we're very excited to get talking about this important topic. Before we get started with the talks, I'd just like to run through a few practical points. So both of our speakers will talk for approximately 15 minutes. And following these talks, we will have a Q&A session that covers both presentations. So if you do have a question for either of our speakers, then please use the Q&A box on the right of your screen. You can enter a question at any time, and you can also upvote questions that you would like to be answered. We'll try our very best to pass on as many questions as possible to the speakers during the Q&A. And if you have a particular speaker in mind that you would like to answer your question, then please do include the name of the speaker as you pop your questions into that Q&A box. Now, I'm honoured to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Paula Rochon. Paula is the founding director of Women's Age Lab at Women's College Hospital, professor in the Department of Medicine and Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation, and RTO Chair in Geriatric Medicine at the University of Toronto. Her career is focused on promoting the health and well-being of older adults, particularly women, and finding new ways to improve their lives. She has published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals, is chair of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Aging Advisory Board, deputy editor of the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, and was awarded the Eugenie Stewart Award for Best Thesis Supervisor from the University of Toronto Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation. She founded Women's Age Lab, the first and only research centre of its kind to focus on improving the health and well-being of older women. Through decades of experience and leadership, Dr. Rochon is creating a space for collaboration on science-driven health and social change that will improve the lives of older adults, specifically women. Paula, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and lovely to be here with you all today. So I'm going to be talking about shifting to more accurate and inclusive language as we rethink this whole thing around aging. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to be able to describe the relationship between ageism and language, and start to talk about how we understand how using sex, gender, and age-inclusive language really helps to address ageism and gendered ageism in particular, and to explore strategies for improving accurate and inclusive language in the scholarly or academic writing that we all do. And maybe we'll just start with a little bit of some of the terms that we're going to be using today. So, you may be familiar with the term ageism, which is discrimination basically based on your age. But you may be less familiar with the term gendered ageism, which is discrimination based on your age, as well as discrimination based on your sex. Now, it's interesting that the term ageism was coined, probably in the late 1960s by Robert Butler. Was one of the first people to really bring this term forward. And I think, especially more recently, it's a term that we've been using a lot. But it took about another 25 years before the idea of gendered ageism came forward as well. So it's a newer term. But it's very important to think about these terms, ageism and gendered ageism, because they're a bit of a root issue that runs through a lot of the things that we do, especially in our work around older adults, and especially when we're thinking about older women. Now, where does ageism occur? And I think we've got some pieces here that come from work that's done from the WHO, which I think is really helpful when we think about ageism and where it occurs. So, for example, ageism can be something that we do to ourselves. It can be self-directed in the way we use our language. It can be something that is between individuals in parts of conversation. And it can also be something that happens at more of an institutional or policy level. So when we think about self-directed ageism, it can be, for example, when you're thinking about older people saying, oh, I'm too old, I can't really do this, or, this might be too difficult for me or too complicated. That's where people are kind of internalizing it with their language. The interpersonal piece is something that we probably see a lot and maybe don't really recognize. It's often things like, for example, people may be sharing or giving somebody a birthday card, and maybe they're turning 50 or 60 or whatever the age. And they'll be saying things like, oh, you must be getting forgetful. You've reached a certain age. So it's meant to be sort of lighthearted. It's not necessarily meant to be harmful, but it's in conversations that are going on between people. And it also can happen at the institutional level where, for example, people of different ages maybe, for example, aren't allowed to have certain kinds of tests or procedures in a medical setting. So it can occur in a variety of different ways. Now, it's also interesting that a lot of the things I'll talk about, because my focus is often on older people and especially older women. And when I think about ageism, I'm thinking about it as it relates to older adults. But it's really important to also recognize that this is something that's very important for younger people as well. So it's kind of the two ends of the spectrum. You can imagine for younger people, it's about, oh, you're too young to do this, or you don't have enough experience, or I think you should give it a bit more time. So it happens in both ways. It can impact younger people, but it also certainly impacts older people. Now, when we think about ageism in language, this is something that's really important because what you say impacts how other people feel or how you feel. And so language is really important in that sense. And saying things like, for example, you're too old to do something, or suggesting that you're maybe going to be forgetful because you've reached a certain age, can actually make people feel bad. And in so doing, it can actually end up being harmful to their health. It can make them more isolated, not feeling like they want to connect with people in the same way. So it can be very, very harmful. Language can also reinforce different kinds of stereotypes, things that maybe are not necessarily true, but it can bring out, for example, some of the negative connotation, and that can be very harmful as well. We often talk about ageism and language and where that's happening, and we think often about this is something that's happening in the media, and we talk about social media where, for example, older adults may be depicted as being frail or forgetful or things like that, which may not in fact be true. But I think we need to recognize that it goes well beyond that. It's social media, it's the newspapers we read, But here today, we're talking about some of the scholarly work that we do, so research and academic writing. And I think it's really important to recognize that those of us who are very much in that area and who are leaders in this space also fall into this same problem of using language that's actually fairly ageist. So, for example, I'm a deputy editor at JAGS, and I read a lot of articles that are coming in. And it's interesting how people are using terms that I don't think we currently think are the best terms to think of or to use when we're talking about older people. So, for example, the word seniors is one that's highlighted here. That's not a term that would necessarily be preferred, but it's one that is used often by government. It's used by shops where they have Seniors Day, where you get discounts and things like that. It's widely used. But in academic writing, people use that term. They use terms like the aged and the old and elderly and aging and dependence and young old. They use all of these different kinds of terms. Where in contrast, there are other terms that are considered to be more appropriate now. Terms like older adults, older persons, older population, terms that are a bit more clear about what they're describing. And I do know that the American Geriatric Society, as well as the British Geriatric Society, have put together guidance on what is the terminology that you ought to be using when you're writing about older adults in your work. Now, language is important, but also images are really important. And images are something that we see in the media, we see social media, we see all over. But it's also something that's becoming increasingly important in our academic work as well, where we may be putting in figures or other images to help explain the work that we're doing. Now, when we're thinking about images, often if you look at the left-hand side of the pictures that I have here, you'll see older people portrayed as being very frail. So people with canes, using walkers, looking like they need assistance. And I think we have to remember that the vast majority, for example, of older people actually are living in the community and are living quite well and active lives. And so on the far side here, we have some examples of imagery that helps to convey the diversity of aging and all of the things that people are potentially doing with their lives, which is a much more positive view of what aging actually does look like for the majority of people. So we need to start reflecting in the language that we use and the images that we use in our academic work in particular, what the reality really is. So, for example, here, when we're talking about people who are olding, or who are getting older in the next slide, there's a variety of terms that are used that are probably not what we want to use. So things like there's a tidal wave of older adults or a tsunami of older adults. And we've heard about the word seniors and elderly and aging dependence and the idea of struggles and battles that this is something that we need to sort of work against. I don't think that's the feeling that we want to give about aging. Instead, we want to talk about what are some of the things about the demographics and how they are changing, and what are the things that we can do to help people live their lives as best as they can. Most people want to live as healthy lives as possible, and we want to talk about that. And thinking about aging as a process, something that changes over time and leads perhaps to new opportunities and new abilities. So thinking about older people and older adults in our language. Now, another piece that we don't necessarily think about when we're thinking about language is how do we describe some of the conditions that perhaps may be more common as people become older. So as people become older, they develop more chronic conditions. We know that. And so there's ways that we want to describe this. So one of the pieces that comes up a lot in the work that we do is work related to talking about dementia. So when we're talking about dementia in our scholarly writing, we don't want to use terms like a demented or demented persons or thinking about senile dementia. We want to think about terms that are much more person-centered. So we can talk about persons living with dementia. So we talk about the person or the individual. The same thing with other conditions. A person may be living with arthritis. They may be living with all sorts of things. But we want to use a much more person-centered language when we're talking about that. And then one thing when we're thinking about our scholarly writing and how we're conveying information, we want to think about older adults as not necessarily being a single group. So here what I have is a really nice image that talks about the stages of human development. So you start off when people are very little, when they're babies, and then you go into infancy, and maybe there's early childhood and later childhood, and you get into adolescence, and you get into early adult and middle age, and then all of a sudden there's older people. Now, I think it's really important that we have all of those different ways to describe people as they're going from being infants through to adults. I think that is great. But I do think we need to think about how we're describing people who are older. It's not just a single group. So for example, everyone over the age of 60, let's say, it is not just one group. Somebody who's 60, I think we could imagine, is different than somebody who's 90. And I think we need to be able to convey that information when we're describing older adults in our academic writing. And so to leave you here with just a final thought, that our hope ultimately is that language will be much more accurate and inclusive, which will contribute to health equity, which we all want. And something that we forget sometimes is that we're all aging. And so we do need to make sure that we get the language right. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, for your wonderful presentation. Please do continue to share your questions in the Q&A box. As a reminder, we'll be moving on to our next panelist and address the questions from both presentations after our second speaker. So I would like to now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Zoe Mullen, to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Thank you, Paula, for that great presentation. So I'm Zoe Mullen. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Lancet Global Health, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Desmond, or Des O'Neill, who's a Professor of Geriatric Medicine and Scholar in Cultural Gerontology at Trinity College Dublin, Ireland. His key focus is on how cultural gerontology and age studies, our understanding of aging through the arts and humanities, can engage and synergize with medical and health humanities scholarship. His work covers a range of cultural outputs, and he's particularly keen to mainstream cultural gerontology to the greatest extent possible in major medical journals such as The Lancet. He's a past chair of Humanities, Arts and Cultural Gerontology Advisory Panel of the Gerontological Society of America, and currently co-chairs Medical and Health Humanities at both Trinity College Dublin and the Irish Humanities Alliance. He's also the Associate Editor for Geriatric Medical Humanities in the journal European Geriatric Medicine. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Des. Please take it away.
Thanks very much. And Paula has given a really nice introduction, and some elements of what I'm going to say will be very congruent and confluent with what she was saying, and there's no harm in that. This is a particularly interesting focus because ageism, as Paula has mentioned, and I will cover again, is possibly the last tolerated or quasi-tolerated discrimination widespread. In a way, it is tolerated more in the public arena and private arenas in a way that discrimination on the basis of gender or sexual orientation would not be acceptable. But scholarly journals should really be at the cutting edge, should be at the forefront of eliminating its contribution in this area here, and perhaps alerting the various communities it serves, all the stakeholders, as to how we can find language which promotes an appropriate, positive and complex approach to the greatest social advance of the last century, which is that most of us are going to live considerably longer than our parents and especially our grandparents. And most of us are going to live for a longer, healthy life expectancy. But indeed, it's also the vulnerability at the end of our life that is part of what makes aging special. It makes us search for meaning. So ageism has clearly been a focus. The World Health Organization has produced this report on ageism. And in some ways, it is helpful that it has included aging across the spectrum. But in fact, within this report, we know that they found it very difficult to find. They could only find 10 publications on the impact of ageism on younger people, and the results were inconsistent. So it's certainly an area to be developed into the future. But in terms of older people, they are the key target for the negative aspects of ageism. It's pervasive, it's toxic at an individual, professional, and societal level. So if you harbor negative views of aging as an older person and go into hospital, you will do less well in terms of your outcomes than somebody with the exact same makeup of illnesses, but who actually harbors a positive view, is happy to be aging, is happy to be older, understand that we have gains as well as losses. It's unique as it's the only discrimination that's potentially against ourselves. It's against our own future selves. As we say, it's not only the turkeys voting for Christmas, but actually they're self-basting and preheating the oven. Advocacy and professions and older people all may harbor ageism. And sometimes it's usually unconscious, it's unwitting, it's largely out there in advertising. But even within advocacy, sometimes the bringing together the complexity that there is growth and loss in later life is challenging. And lastly, gerontological illiteracy is widely tolerated. If we were speaking about areas of cancer or areas of space exploration, well, we'd be expected to know something about it. And there's a very large body of science across the spectrum on aging, and yet people feel free to speak in a somewhat casual and dilettantish manner. So these are the framework within which this is set. And part of what's been useful about this exercise is to reflect what we as geriatricians and gerontologists, geriatricians being that segment of gerontology, the broader sciences of aging, which deals with health. But there's wider areas, social, psychological, biological. But it may appear that unconsciously in our language, we may reflect some of that broader societal stigma. So, for example, in the earliest textbook of geriatric medicine by Ignaz Nasher in 1914, he spoke of how we realize that for all practical purposes, the lives of the aged are useless, that they are often a burden to themselves, their family and community at large. Their appearance is generally unaesthetic, their actions objectionable, their very existence often an incubus to those who in their humanity or duty take it upon themselves the care of the aged. And this is really, to a certain extent, elements of this have remained within the DNA of society, geriatric medicine and gerontology. So it's not just, this is hopefully the beginning of perhaps a project and a dialogue between gerontology, geriatric medicine, and the scientific publishing community to see how we can actually make progress on this. Indeed, we did a review of how we understand cognitive aging in geriatric medicine and gerontology textbooks. Now, actually, we gain cognitively in a significant number of ways. I'll talk briefly about older drivers later. Wisdom, altruism, better understanding of social circumstances, better strategic and tactical thinking, not sweating the small things. But the vast majority only described normal cognitive aging in terms of what we lost, not what we gained, completely blanking out on the great advances of great artists and great writers. And we see this throughout the literature of geriatric medicine. This is a piece by geropsychiatrists or old age psychiatrists in the New England Journal of Medicine, bemoaning the fact that they couldn't recruit younger doctors into their profession. But look how they describe aging as a tsunami. There is no upside to a tsunami. A tsunami is a bad thing. So again, in our language, we may actually be self-defeating. So one of the things I'm kind of proud of that we managed with the Lancet is, and I hope this is visible for those of you who are viewing online, is we managed to get them on their front page. And I think the Lancet has been to the fore in trying to develop a better sense of the complexity and richness of aging, that instead of being viewed in terms of a burden on healthcare and on welfare and on finances, it should living into old age should be a cause for celebration. And we should be celebrating the longevity dividend. And I'm here as a geriatrician to nurture, support, and protect the longevity dividend, because aging is the most wonderful bonus to us as a society. And moving into that language of the longevity dividend is a key element to resolving this issue. So, coming to the ICJME, the International Commission on Medical Journal Editors, in December 2018, they very helpfully put in a change that authors should use neutral, precise, and respectful language to describe study participants and avoid the use of terminology that might stigmatize participants. So immediately, I think this turned to focus, and I'm going to bring this talk into 3 areas that we need to focus on. And the first is the common and ordinary descriptors, and I think Paula mentioned these. But it's really quite interesting in that the UN Commission for Human Rights and older people's European advocacy platforms have made it abundantly clear that the one word they do not want used is the word elderly. They don't like aged, they don't like old on its own, but elderly they reject. And this has been a bone of contention. And even within our own European Union Geriatric Medicine Society, when we had our 12th meeting, there were over 200 references to elderly in the abstracts, and we're still at over 100 in our meeting this year in Valencia. Now, we have to be mindful that for people for whom English isn't a second language, there may need to be a clearer steer and guide on the language we use. And indeed, one would have thought with the technology of a spell checker that we could reject for further review any abstract that contained these words. But this is perhaps one area where we could look at language, but there are other areas as well. So, for example, caring is part of our natural moral development as human beings. We are relational beings. We want to care. And yes, our scales at looking at what the lives of carers are like are universally, in terms of older people, put down as caregiver burden. We don't talk about caregiver burden when we're bringing up our children. So really, we should be looking at burdensome aspects of care, because and the caregiver burden, the image comes from a JAMA page, it's a patient help page, and actually, to my mind, it actually further stigmatizes older people. And actually, the moral imperative, I wanted to look after my parents wanted to look after their parents, but they would have liked appropriate relief with the burdensome aspects. The second issue in terms of journals, and again, the ball is also back in the court of gerontologists here, particularly biological gerontologists and health gerontologists. Aging as a disease, and aging back to social gerontology and geriatric medicine as a burden. So again, in the Lancet Healthy Longevity, we see a headline about targeting aging, as if aging is a bad thing. So, and again, this is a subtle and a complex area, But I think it is time, and indeed I've been speaking to one of the editors of Biological Gerontology to do a piece around trying to get some consensus about terminology which is about the undesirable effects of age-related disability, but to stop talking about slowing aging or speeding up aging. That all of these, the implication is that aging is a bad thing, where in fact aging is a bonus and a dividend to us. The second issue is that of what we call apocalyptic demography. This has been beautifully tackled by Gloria Gutman, formerly of University of British Columbia, but constantly we get these sort of headlines about unaffordable demography, whereas in fact there are counter studies, Kevin Murphy from Chicago, showing that the aging population actually brings gains. The third area, and we're nearly finishing here, is the persistence of study types which unnecessarily stigmatize aging. And one of the problems here is PhD conveyor belts taking stuff off long-term care studies like the health and retirement study, looking at, for example, studies on loneliness among older people. Loneliness in the developed world peaks between the ages of 15 and 35. And without including a lifespan element, we're stigmatizing older people, we're caricaturing old age as the time of loneliness, and we're actually avoiding, here's actually ageism, we're avoiding looking at solutions that'll help younger people. So these study types are actually hitting ageism at both ends of the spectrum. Older drivers is a particular area of research of mine, and it's actually driving me quite crazy. I've written the references there that they're the safest group of drivers on the road, but because funding comes from road safety authorities and others, every paper I review I send back because it talks about the cognitive losses of aging and not the cognitive gains in strategic and tactical thinking that make older drivers better drivers. In fact, if people were serious, older people have less crashes but are more likely to die. So let's start making airbags and safety belts more age-attuned, age-attuning traffic systems, and stopping routine medical screening. So this is one between the scientific bodies and the scientific journals. Lastly, there is a significant critique of successful aging because the antonym is failed aging. And I love this paper. I may be frail, but I ain't no failure. So let's look at terms like optimal aging, where the quality of the aging is set by the older person himself or herself. So lastly, a very brief run through a very helpful initiative which joins academia, advocacy, older people about reframing aging with the two key bits of it, confronting injustice and embracing the dynamic. So what we get here is, instead of talking about a tidal wave or a tsunami, we would say, talk affirmatively, as Europeans live longer and healthier lives, instead of choice, planning, control, which were really outside the remit of the older people, emphasizing how to improve social context. Let's find creative solutions to ensure we can all thrive as we age. Instead of seniors, elderly, aging dependents, use more inclusive, neutral terms. I particularly like us as we age when I talk to older people's groups or other groups, but us as we age, older people is what the groups have asked for. Older adults has come in, particularly from North America. I don't have a significant problem with it, but I prefer people to adults. Okay. Instead of, again, we know this from cancer and dementia, people would really want us to stop the struggle, battle, and fight, but talk through more aging as a dynamic process that needs to new abilities and knowledge that we can share with our communities. Okay. And define ageism rather than talking about it. It's discrimination against older people due to negative and inaccurate stereotypes, and that sets the bar. So finishing off, I've been particularly interested in the uneasy relationship between older people's advocacy groups and geriatric medicine and gerontology. And it's an area that actually requires a bit of fence building. But this, to me, looks like a wonderful start to look at scholarly journals and outputs and to see how we can make the message and celebrate our longevity dividend. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Des. That was great. Very, very lively and very convincing discussion. I particularly like the sort of self-basing turkey idea that, actually we're all, if we're doing making ageist comments, we're essentially discriminating against ourselves, as hopefully all of us will at one point become older. And I like the idea that that you referred to caring. Caring of older adults is always seen as a burden, whereas you wouldn't say that about caring for children, for young children. It's almost a privilege to be caring for young children, whereas it's always nearly always seen as a burden for older adults. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to hand over to Rachel, who will kick us off with our round of Q&A.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks, Des, for your insightful presentation. Let's get straight into the questions. So we have a question from Ken Nosaka. Apologies for any incorrect pronunciation. So Ken asks, is it rude to ask people for their age, but some older people want to tell us their ages? We need to know the ages of our study participants. What is the most appropriate way to ask age of study participants? Would also like to know, could you suggest a good term to call older adults over 80 years of age? So is it okay to state, for example, 65 years old or 65 years of age? So there's a couple of questions in there, so we can repeat them if needed. Paula, would you like to start?
So the first question, I think, was about how do you ask people about their age, right? I think this is a question that we need to do for a lot of the research that we do, and often we'll put people, depending on what we do. If it's things like administrative data, for example, you don't need to ask; you can get the exact age. But often we'll use age ranges and ask people about age ranges and do they fit? Which age range do they fit in? And I think people do respond well to that.
Thank you. Des, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think there's no real issue about asking people their age. It's interesting, our sense of where we define who is an older adult person and at what stage. And of course, this is a bit of a moving feast. If you're a woman movie star in Hollywood, their definition of what an older star is, as we all know, is absurdly low. However, there clearly has to be some pragmatics around aging. We have decided certain ages for aging. People may be foolish at 40 and very wise at 16, but most countries have settled on 18. And there is a clear evidence that the degree of complexity does still begin to take off. I think complexity is the hallmark of aging, begins to take off around 65. I'm not sure that there is a clear or good descriptor or indeed a reason to be looking at the very old, other than perhaps I wouldn't try and use a word like the oldest old. I would describe exactly what they are. So if they're centenarians, or we have chosen people between 80 and 90, or people over 90 for and explain why you've chosen that group. That's probably the key issue. So, for example, there was a wonderful study when at the reunification of Germany from Rostock, their demography institute, which they chose people over 90 for a particular reason to see, could you influence healthy aging after 90, given the change in circumstances with West German welfare? And in fact, they did show, even at 90, there was plasticity, that people from the East, after the wall came down, did better under West German health and welfare conditions. So start early, but it's never too late. So I think describe the number and the reason you chose the number rather than trying to find another descriptor.
Absolutely, I like that. And I think that's come into a number of our talks on inclusive language. Actually, what we're trying to do, as well as being inclusive in these, is particularly in scholarly publishing, but is to be scientifically accurate. So, if you're just talking about older people, what does that mean? So I think in order to avoid a lot of these problems we get ourselves into, just specify the age, the actual age range, and as you say, Paula, that's most people, well, in most studies, that's perfectly acceptable to ask for that. Paula, there's a question. This is an interesting one because we've been talking about clinical aging essentially, but Aishwarya asks, working in the animal setting, animal models of disease, what terms do you use for referring to animals that are considered sort of models of old age? Should we be using different terms here, or should we be trying to think of something different, even when we're talking about geriatric mice, for example? Any thoughts on that?
Well, what a question. I don't think I've ever actually really thought about that. Certainly as somebody who hasn't worked with animals for quite some time, although I did work with rats early on. But, you know, when you think about it, why wouldn't we do the same thing as we do with people, that you describe it for what it is? So I think if you're looking at an older animal, then I think you're going to describe it that way. And perhaps you might have also some years that you can attach to it. But I don't think we would want to fall into the same kind of issues that we're already describing and trying to address in terms of using language that isn't really appropriate. So I think maybe the same principles should apply. And maybe that's something to think about a lot more.
There's an interesting researcher called Dan O'Neill in the Royal, no relation, in the Royal Veterinary Hospital in the UK, who does a significant amount of work around aging animals. And again, I think they've been quite smart. His work is worth looking at. He's looked at a lot at older animals. Indeed, has suggested that older domestic pets are actually a better testing ground in terms of obesity, under exercising, than laboratory animals for pharmacological tests, if you were going to do such a thing. I mean, partially tongue-in-cheek, I think. But it's around generally finding a matrix whereby complexity arrives, or where the illness that you're interested in, an age-related illness, comes in. So particularly, for example, around the Alzheimer's and Huntington's type mice. So again, it's about describing it rather than trying to find a convenient label that may trip you up later on.
Thank you both. That's a fascinating question, and from a perspective that I myself hadn't quite considered before. So thank you very much for that question. Returning slightly to humans, could you share your thoughts on treating aging as a disease? Some experts are starting to view it this way, given the possibility of developing treatments to address the underlying biological processes.
Well, I suppose I started the ball rolling there. Yeah, no, I think it's a really troublesome concept. But unfortunately, as I said, we in the field probably haven't promoted an identifiable label which helps people say we're actually treating age-related disease or age-related pathologies. So I think, and I'd be happy with age-related disease and pathology, because by and large, if you look at almost any element of whether it's frailty or sarcopenia or any of the syndromes, they have very strong biopsychosocial roots, particularly around vascular illness. I have suggested to the biological community that we should really try and use senescence, perhaps, as a term for the elements of age-related disability. But using the bold term, again, further undermines the positivities and benefits we get with aging. And I think it's particularly helpful to try and use the arts and humanities in this. I think, for example, the recent film, The Substance, shows neatly the challenge of altering aging without altering wisdom. So I think it's a very unfortunate turn of events, and is causing tension between the gerontological communities and this new sort of anti-aging movement. And I think we need to be tackling this more aggressively. Paula, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think too that aging is something that's very different for individuals. You know, some people will develop conditions that may be more common with aging, and different kinds of chronic conditions. And I think we want to speak about those conditions separately. But other people will live quite long lives without developing a lot of conditions. So it is quite different. And I definitely do not think of aging in itself as a disease, or would not want to think of it that way at all.
Thank you. So now I'm going to come to a question that sort of takes a slightly different approach, and we've talked about the best practices, but we've been speaking about the English language. All these words are English language words, and of course we're speaking from North America and Europe. Are you aware of any differences in how we refer to age across languages and cultures, and whether there are best practices that are sort of universal, regardless of which language is being spoken, or are there more nuanced approaches that we need to think about?
Well, maybe I could start with a couple of things. So one, when we think about the language in different places or different cultures, it's interesting when you go to other countries and they're actually using English. They're often not necessarily using the kinds of terms that we were talking about today. And maybe that's part of not being as fluent with the language, or not sort of thinking about the language in the same way. But that's getting at the terms like we just talked about people being described as geriatric or elderly, or terms that we don't necessarily want to hear. But in some cultures, some of the terms that maybe we may not think of so much, maybe more or just preferred. So I'm thinking of, for example, the term elder. In some societies, that's considered to be distinction and somebody who's wise, and it has a very positive kind of connotation to it. And so I think we do need to think about what are some of those terms that are very particular to different cultures, and learn about those and respect those terms. And I don't think we've done enough in that area.
Thank you. Des, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, this is an interesting one, and the hegemony of the English language in the scientific literature is kind of interesting. Certainly, some of the concepts that have come through in aging, such as frailty, translate poorly into other languages. And just as we might use words like Schadenfreude, you find in the German and French literature they're using the word frailty. But certainly I know from having worked with older people in France, there are acceptable terms and non-acceptable terms. It's interesting, there seem to be comfort, and again, it's around comfort and something that allows for complexity. So les vieux is generally, and again, Paul is in a bilingual country, les vieux is not seen well, whereas la troisième âge is seen as well. And that has then implications potentially around the fourth age, which they don't seem to have adopted. So yes, there are subtleties in other languages, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure how well it translates or how hot a topic it is. And certainly something I'm going to back to our European society perhaps to ask.
Great, thank you.
That kind of speaks to some of the points that I think we need to go and talk with people in different settings, in different cultures, to understand more about what that terminology is for them. So I feel like we have a lot of work to do there.
Absolutely, yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think actually involving older people in some of these studies and in the different cultures, and asking them to express their views on how the terminology is being used, I think that's also potentially important. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Relatedly to that question, how would researchers engage with older adults and populations, community stakeholders to ensure that the language reflects their lived experiences and the preferences of those they are studying? Do you have any recommendations, guidelines that you can advise for people planning their research and undertaking that research?
Well, there's a very nice piece by the British Geriatric Society and Age UK, which looked at particularly the evolving concept of frailty, which has caught fire across a wider spectrum. I think it's the first concept in geriatric medicine, gerontology, that has really spread widely. And it's quite interesting. The older people have asked that we don't describe an older person as a frail older person, but as a person living with frailty. So I think engaging with advocacy and working with focus groups therein, I think is important within individual cultures, and probably also important even within the variety and diversity of ways of speaking English in the Anglophone world.
I think there's also interesting opportunities when you think about engaging with older people. We're often doing it around research that we're working on. And there are individuals now, patient partners, who have come forward who want to be engaged in these processes. And they're invaluable for, getting their advice on, you just asked, how would you ask about aging? What would be the questions that people would like to hear? You get people's input on that, and it really helps guide what you're doing. They're also have been very, very valuable on thinking about our research agendas and being on the national panels to give advice too about how are we sort of targeting some of our research. So I think there's huge opportunities thinking about the idea of patient-oriented research involving patients or persons, citizens, in all the work that we do. And I really think it makes a huge difference to advancing and making it much more useful.
Yeah, I was very marked by, and sometimes through humanities and arts, we get a third ear of a different way of thinking. And I was particularly struck during a theatre exercise when we asked the participants about some terms, and one woman was asked, we asked them what they thought about successful aging as a term. And one of the women said, I'm going to have to think about that. And she came back next day and said, well, I know what it is. It's an oxymoron. So, patient, public involvement. And again, it's interesting within our studies, it's clearly public and patient, but I think in this broader sense, it's really important to get the public sense.
Very true, because so often people are not patients. And so therefore you want to think about a citizen perspective or, sort of broader view.
Absolutely. Des, you touched on something there that Lunan is asking in the quick Q&A, and you mentioned this also as in the sort of positive framing of aging in your presentation, talking about successful or healthy aging, and they say perhaps that's actually equating health status with successfulness of aging, and they're sort of putting pressure on older people to somehow justify their existence in the world by being healthy and successful in some way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge in terms of, to a certain extent, one of the downsides of successful aging is almost a neoliberal pushing back of whether you're successful or not onto whether you were somebody who lived a healthy lifestyle, whereas in fact, to have optimal aging actually depends on the broader sociocultural palette. For example, the drop in incidence in Alzheimer's disease in most of the developed world has been focused in the Framingham study to education and your educational attainments, and almost certainly related to social inequality. So actually, there's a broader framing to this. And I think the second piece is we are all going to die and we're all going to be vulnerable at some stage. Now, clearly, there is a point to which we wish to optimize this. But actually, awareness of our frailties and vulnerability is widely recognized as one of the engines of us searching meaning and of actually of self-actualization. So you almost tend to blank out the fact that we are vulnerable, interdependent relational beings. This is part of the eventual makeup. So it's not being negative about positive, broad public health interventions, but the real problem with successful aging is again it's antonym of failed aging, and that's a problem.
Thank you.
Just about everyone, as we age, we all are developing different kinds of conditions, or people have chronic conditions. I mean, that is part of what we all are experiencing. And so I think to say that, the idea that successful aging would be the absence of that kind of thing is clearly not the case. I think it's people will have issues and will have problems, and how do they achieve the best health and well-being that they can within whatever the context is.
Thank you both. I think those perspectives touch on our influence as well in terms of using the language and setting the stage for what language we're using, and the reframing of age and aging. And this relates to Mohammed's question, which is how can inclusive language in scientific research and publications influence societal attitudes towards aging?
Yeah, well, I think because particularly successful scientific publishing eventually finds its way very much towards the public and the media. There's a very large space dedicated particularly around to health journals. So I think people do tend to pick up on the language as thought leaders. I think it's very important. I think the other important part is, and a particular commendation to the Lancet for its perspective section, is I think we all need to keep a strong sense of the socio-cultural framing of what we're doing. And I think that's an important part. And I think overcoming the social death of dementia through language was one very important key piece, for example, in the Lancet. So I think when an influential journal sneezes, I think the popular press does catch the cold.
Thanks, Des. Paula, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I do think that, as you're saying, if leaders in the academic world are putting out information that's helpful in that regard, people pay attention. And if people are talking about it, people pay attention. So I think the journals have a big role to play to bring this up so people can see it.
Thank you. And in a related question to that is from Sherry. What advice can the panelists offer on how an editor should engage with authors who have interesting data but have not written the paper in an age-positive way?
Well, I feel that's something that, Des, you probably have a similar experience, but working in your editor role, you're seeing it all the time. And I think that's what we're both saying is, we've talked about things happening out there in the media and social media, but what about what's happening right in front of us? And I think as an editor, you have a role in pointing out how things ought to be framed or what the language ought to be. You can't just sort of let it pass. You have to really talk about it. And I find, whenever I'm looking at these things, I think I do make comments directly back to the authors. And then I find it's very helpful to have guidance that you can refer them to. So there's guidance from the American Geriatric Society and there's guidance from the British Geriatric Society, which is helpful. So they have something to look at. But maybe we need to have a refresh on some of that guidance because it's something that I feel I'm using almost every day. It's something that's really important and really needed.
Yeah, it's possibly a harder bit of our, possibly it occurs with other areas where people are subject to discrimination. Is, most of us are doing our editor thing voluntarily part-time. And I think this might be an area where perhaps, AI might come to our help if we were to put something in to detect where and to feedback, because I do find when we point this out to authors, they generally pick up on this. So it's part of, I suppose, the educational bit of what we do. But actually, thinking on the hoof, I'm just wondering if we couldn't have some more systematic way of doing this.
Well, I think you have an interesting point there. What are some of the potential uses? Because when you see the language as a problem in some pieces, it's often throughout the manuscript. And so there might be ways that we can use technology to help us with that.
Thank you both.
Sorry, Rachel, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you both for those insights. We are rapidly running out of time, so I'd like to just thank our panelists for their presentations and for their responses to our questions today. And we'll just close the Q&A there, and I'll just hand back over to Alyssa for our closing.
Fantastic. We've come to the end of our session. Thanks again so much to our speakers, Professors Paula Rochon and Desmond O'Neill, for your engaging presentations. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in today to learn more about inclusive language around age and aging. Thank you for your insightful questions. If you missed anything during the webinar, or would like to listen to it again, remember that a recording will be available shortly and posted on cell.com. If you have any comments about the webinar or suggestions for future topics, we'd also love to hear from you by email at cpwebinars@cell.com. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
Thank you.